What if the end of history does not begin with a date, but with a condition? Not a red moon, not a headline, not a viral prediction chart counting down to midnight, but something quieter, something harder to measure. For centuries, people have tried to calculate the return of Christ, drawing timelines, decoding symbols, setting dates that came and went. But long before modern prophecy movements, an ancient Christian community in Africa preserved a very different vision. In the Ethiopian tradition, the end was never about guessing when, it was about recognizing what. They believed the world itself would testify when the time was near, not through spectacle, thirst, but through moral atmosphere, through the slow inversion of truth, through hearts hardening long before institutions collapse, through creation responding to humanity's choices in ways subtle and then unmistakable. And here's the part most people miss. In this tradition, the final sign is not what modern Christians usually expect. It is not centered on a single personality or a dramatic event. It is something deeper, more unsettling, and perhaps closer than we think. So stay with us. Because to understand the signs, we first have to understand the worldview that shaped them. And once you see that framework, you may begin to notice something surprising, not on a calendar, but in the condition of the world itself. If you value historically grounded explorations like this, consider subscribing and joining us. Let's think through this together. What if the reason we misunderstand the signs is because we're reading from a different library? Imagine walking into a church where the Bible is familiar: Genesis, Psalms, the Gospels. And yet, when the reading continues, you hear something unexpected. The book of Enoch, Jubilees, texts that sound ancient, cosmic, almost unfamiliar to Western ears, not hidden, not secret, just preserved. Before we can understand the Ethiopian vision of the end of the age, we have to understand the worldview that shaped it, because the signs only make sense inside the library that carries them. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves one of the largest biblical canons in historic Christianity, traditionally counted as 81 books. That number alone often surprises modern readers. But the significance is not the number, it is the continuity. Within this canon are texts like 1 Enoch and Jubilees writings that circulated widely in Jewish communities during the Second Temple period, centuries before Christ. Fragments of Enoch were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. That matters. It tells us that Enoch was not an Ethiopian invention. It was part of a broader Jewish apocalyptic tradition that early Christians knew well. In fact, the New Testament book of Jude explicitly quotes from 1 Enoch. Early Christian writers, such as Tertullian, even treated Enoch as authoritative, though later Western traditions eventually did not include it in their final canon. Why Ethiopia retained it while much of the Western Church did not is still discussed among scholars. Some suggest geographic distance preserved older traditions. Others point to the unique development of the Ethiopian Church after its conversion in the 4th century under King Azana. There is no single scholarly consensus. What we can say with confidence is this: Ethiopia preserved a stream of apocalyptic theology that was once more widespread, and that stream shaped how they understood reality. In the Ethiopian worldview, heaven and earth are not separate layers loosely connected. They are morally integrated. Angels, stars, seasons, covenanters, kings all exist within a unified order under divine authority. The Book of Enoch, especially in its astronomical book sections, presents a cosmos structured and obedient. The sun rises because it is commanded. The stars follow paths assigned to them. Creation functions in loyalty to its creator. Humanity, however, is capable of stepping outside that order. That contrast becomes the foundation of Ethiopian eschatology. The end of the age is not random catastrophe. It is what happens when moral disorder reaches a point where restoration becomes necessary. This is where modern readers sometimes misunderstand apocalyptic literature. Today, we often read it like code. We look for charts, we look for hidden timelines. But in the ancient Jewish and early Christian imagination, apocalyptic writing was less about predicting specific dates and more about unveiling the spiritual dimension of history. The word apocalypse itself means revelation, NT, Wright once wrote that apocalyptic language is about pulling back the curtain on what is really happening in the world. Whether one agrees with every aspect of his interpretation or not, the framing is helpful. Ethiopian theology reads apocalyptic texts not as puzzles to solve, but as lenses to see through. And this is crucial, because once you adopt that lens, the signs before Christ's return are not isolated events dropped into history. They are the logical outcome of a moral cosmos. Even the structure of time in Enoch reflects this. The so-called apocalypse of weeks divides history into symbolic periods marked by righteousness and corruption. Scholars debate whether these divisions reflect specific historical eras or theological patterns. Some see them as retrospective, written after events to interpret them. Others see them as visionary frameworks. What is clear is that history is presented as morally structured, not chaotic. That structure deeply influenced Ethiopian preaching and monastic writing. The question was never, can we calculate the end? The question was, where are we in the moral arc? That shift changes everything. If you approach the signs looking for headlines, you will miss them. But if you approach them asking whether humanity is aligned with divine order, the signs begin to look different. And here is the quiet climax of this section. The Ethiopian canon did not merely add extra books. It preserved an integrated worldview in which heaven, earth, angels, and humanity are inseparably connected. In that world, sin is not just rule-breaking. It is cosmic disruption. Righteousness is not private virtue. It is participation in divine harmony. Without that framework, the three signs we are about to explore can sound abstract. With it, they become inevitable. So, before we move into the first sign, pause for a moment and consider this. What if the question is not whether the signs are visible, but whether we are reading from the right lens? Because once you see history as a moral cosmos, the condition of the world may begin to look less random and more revealing. What if the first sign of the end is not something you see in the sky, but something you feel in the air? Not fire, not armies, not even collapse. Just a subtle shift, a reversal, a world where what was once called good begins to feel negotiable, and what was once unthinkable slowly becomes normal. In the Ethiopian tradition, the first sign before the return of Christ is not political upheaval or celestial spectacle. It is moral inversion, a condition in which righteousness becomes rare, truth is bent for convenience, and injustice no longer shocks the conscience. Jesus himself warned of such a time. In the Gospel of Matthew, he speaks of lawlessness increasing and the love of many growing cold. Paul, writing to the Thessalonians, describes a mystery of lawlessness already at work. These are New Testament texts familiar to many Christians, but in the Ethiopian canon, they are read alongside older apocalyptic writings such as 1 Enoch, where history is portrayed as moving through cycles of corruption and renewal. In what scholars call the apocalypse of weeks in 1 Enoch, humanity repeatedly drifts into periods marked by injustice and violence. Whether these symbolic weeks correspond to specific historical eras is debated. Some scholars interpret them as retrospective theological reflections on Israel's history. Others see them as visionary structures. What matters for our purposes is not the precise timeline, but the pattern. Moral decay precedes divine intervention, and that decay begins internally. The Ethiopian theological imagination emphasizes that corruption starts in the heart, long before it manifests in institutions. Leaders do not wake up one morning and suddenly abandon justice. Communities do not instantly forget sacred order. It happens gradually. Reverence fades. Accountability weakens. Truth becomes flexible. C.S. Lewis once observed, "We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise." He was writing about modern education, but the insight reaches further. When moral formation thins out, public life eventually reflects it. The Ethiopian reading of the days of Noah follows a similar logic. According to Genesis, society continued building, planting, marrying, outwardly stable while inwardly decaying. The flood did not interrupt a healthy civilization. It interrupted one that had already hollowed itself. In Ethiopian sermons and commentaries, this is not treated as mere metaphor. It is a pattern. Humanity forgets its place within creation. Violence increases, arrogance grows, divine authority is treated as optional. In 1 Enoch, the corruption of humanity is intertwined with rebellion among spiritual beings, the so-called Watchers. Scholars differ on how literally to read these narratives. Some view them as symbolic critiques of ancient power structures. Others see them as theological accounts of spiritual disorder. But in either case, the effect is the same. Moral boundaries blur. And here is the quiet crescendo of this first sign. What is good is redefined. What is destructive is justified. Covenant is mocked. Law is treated as inconvenience, not because people consciously reject goodness, but because they slowly adjust its meaning. Alexander Solzhenitsyn once wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." That line, in Ethiopian eschatology, is not erased at the end of the age. It is exposed. But before it is exposed, it becomes obscured. Now, it is important to be careful here. The Ethiopian tradition does not encourage constant panic or the labeling of every generation as uniquely corrupt. Christian history is full of moments when believers believed their era was the worst. The texts themselves do not instruct readers to identify a specific year or political regime as the definitive fulfillment. Rather, they describe conditions, moral atmospheres that signal misalignment with divine order. That distinction matters. This first sign is not about scanning headlines. It is about examining conscience. The collapse described is not primarily economic or governmental. It is spiritual inversion, an internal disorder that eventually manifests externally. And perhaps that is why it is so unsettling, because it invites reflection rather than speculation. If the first sign is moral inversion before collapse, how would we recognize it? Not by a single event, but by a gradual numbing, a loss of reverence, a world where truth becomes negotiable and love grows cold. But if moral disorder is the first movement in this unfolding story, what happens next in a universe where heaven and earth are morally connected? If humanity drifts out of harmony, does creation remain silent? That question leads us to the second sign. What if the sky is not silent? What if the sun, the moon, and the turning of the seasons are not just background scenery to human history, but participants in it? In the Ethiopian biblical imagination, creation is not neutral. It is ordered, responsive, alive with purpose. And when humanity drifts into moral disorder, creation does not simply continue unaffected. It reacts. This idea may sound foreign to modern ears. We are used to thinking of nature as mechanical, governed by impersonal laws, indifferent to human virtue or vice. But in the book of Enoch, especially in what scholars call the astronomical book, chapters 72 through 82, the movements of the sun and stars are described with striking precision. They follow appointed paths. They obey divine command. The cosmos is portrayed as disciplined. Whether one reads these astronomical descriptions as literal ancient cosmology or as symbolic theological poetry is debated among scholars. Some see them as reflecting early Jewish attempts to map the heavens. Others interpret them as moral metaphors, emphasizing order and obedience. What is clear in the text itself is this: creation functions in harmony with its creator. Humanity, however, does not always do the same. And this contrast sets the stage for the second sign. Jesus speaks in the Gospel of Luke about signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Paul in Romans 8 writes that creation groans, waiting for liberation. The Ethiopian tradition reads these passages not as isolated predictions, but as part of a larger moral cosmology inherited from Jewish apocalyptic thought. In that worldview, heaven and earth are interconnected. When covenant is broken, the fracture is not confined to private spirituality. It reverberates outward. Now we must be careful. Ethiopian theology does not encourage sensationalism. It does not invite believers to interpret every eclipse, earthquake, or storm as a direct signal of the end. The texts themselves do not provide a checklist of specific natural disasters. Instead, they describe a pattern. When humanity persists in rebellion, the harmony of creation appears strained. That strain can be understood in more than one way. Some interpreters throughout history have read cosmic disturbance literally expecting visible astronomical anomalies. Others understand the language as apocalyptic symbolism, a way of expressing profound upheaval in human history. Many modern scholars lean towards symbolic interpretation, noting that apocalyptic literature often uses cosmic imagery to describe political or spiritual crisis. But within the Ethiopian tradition, whether literal or symbolic, the meaning remains ethical. Creation groans because it was entrusted to humanity. This is the quiet crescendo of the second sign. Disorder in humanity does not stay contained. It echoes. N.T. Wright once observed that biblical hope is not about escaping creation, but about renewing it. That renewal presupposes that something has gone wrong. In Romans 8, Paul does not say creation is destroyed. He says it longs. It waits. It groans in anticipation of restoration. The Ethiopian reading of Enoch intensifies that imagery. The heavenly bodies obey. The seasons keep their appointments. The cosmos remains faithful even when humanity does not. And when the gap between obedience and rebellion widens, tension builds. Imagine an orchestra where every instrument follows the conductor except one section. At first, the discord is subtle. Then it becomes audible. Eventually, it threatens the whole composition. In apocalyptic language, cosmic disturbance is not chaos for its own sake. It is dissonance revealing misalignment. Again, we must resist modern temptation to attach this immediately to specific contemporary events. Throughout history, plagues, wars, and environmental crises have led believers to ask whether they were witnessing this sign. The Ethiopian tradition, however, consistently emphasizes repentance over speculation. The purpose of the sign is not fear, it is warning. If moral inversion was the internal fracture, cosmic disturbance is the external echo. And here is the deeper theological point. The return of Christ in this framework is not triggered by arbitrary timing. It coincides with creation's longing for restoration. Judgment and healing arrive together. But if creation itself begins to testify, if the fabric of reality seems strained, what or who is responsible for sustaining that disorder? If the cosmos is morally structured and humanity's rebellion reverberates outward, is there more at work behind the scenes than human weakness alone? That question brings us to the third and perhaps most unsettling sign, the unveiling of hidden powers. What if the final sign is not destruction but disclosure? Not fire falling from heaven, not a sudden collapse of civilization, but something quieter and far more unsettling. What if, before Christ returns, what has been hidden begins to surface? In the Ethiopian tradition, the third sign before the end of the age is the exposure of hidden powers, not merely corrupt individuals, not simply failing institutions, but forces spiritual, systemic, and moral that have long operated beneath the visible surface of history. To understand this, we have to return briefly to the book of Enoch. In chapters 6 through 16, Enoch describes the rebellion of the Watchers, angelic beings who abandon their appointed order and corrupt humanity. Scholars debate how this narrative should be understood. Some interpret it mythologically, reflecting ancient Near Eastern traditions about divine beings. Others see it as symbolic language, critiquing oppressive rulers or corrupt priesthoods. What the text itself clearly presents is a world in which rebellion occurs not only on earth, but in the unseen realm. The Watchers are judged, bound, awaiting final reckoning. The Ethiopian tradition reads this not as fantasy, but as part of a moral cosmology. Whether one interprets the Watchers literally or symbolically, the theological claim remains: evil is not always obvious. It can embed itself in systems. It can cloak itself in authority. It can appear righteous while distorting truth. Jesus warned of false messiahs and false prophets. Paul described a man of lawlessness who operates through deception. In Revelation, powers are portrayed symbolically as beasts rising from sea and land. The Ethiopian reading does not obsess over identifying a single historical figure as the Antichrist. Instead, it emphasizes conditions of passive opposition to divine order, expressed through pride, injustice, and manipulation of truth. This distinction is crucial. Modern speculation often narrows the focus to one personality. Ethiopian theology broadens it to a system. Antichrist is less a name and more a posture, any structure that exalts itself above divine authority and distorts what is good. And here is where the crescendo builds. Before Christ returns, according to this tradition, deception intensifies. Counterfeit spirituality flourishes, false righteousness appears convincing, discernment becomes rare. Not because people are incapable of truth, but because truth is skillfully imitated. Alexander Solzhenitsyn once wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." That insight aligns with the Ethiopian emphasis. The exposure of hidden powers is not only about external enemies, it is about unveiling what has quietly shaped human hearts. Again, caution is necessary. The Ethiopian tradition does not promote paranoia. It does not encourage believers to see conspiracies everywhere. The texts do not provide a checklist of secret organizations or coded political movements. Rather, they warn that injustice concealed cannot endure indefinitely. Hypocrisy collapses when brought into light. The climax of this third sign is unveiling. In apocalyptic language, revelation means pulling back the curtain, the hidden motives of rulers, the manipulation beneath institutions, the spiritual emptiness behind performative righteousness. All of it comes into view, and this unveiling prepares the world for judgment, not as spectacle, but as clarity. Throughout Ethiopian monastic writings, the emphasis was never on hunting the Antichrist. It was on cultivating discernment, prayer, humility, because if deception increases before truth is revealed, the faithful must learn to see without panic. That restraint matters. The exposure of hidden powers is not chaos unleashed. It is truth surfacing. What was concealed cannot survive the approach of divine light. And that raises a final, sobering question. If moral inversion distorts the heart, and creation itself begins to groan, and hidden systems of deception are unveiled, what happens when the one who embodies truth fully arrives? Is his return interruption or fulfillment? That is where the Ethiopian vision turns, not toward fear, but toward restoration. What if the end of the world is not an escape plan, but a homecoming? For many modern readers, the return of Christ is imagined as evacuation, believers lifted away, the earth left behind, history abandoned. But in the Ethiopian tradition, the climax of history is not departure, it is restoration. That difference changes everything. After moral inversion distorts the heart, after creation itself groans under strain, after hidden powers are exposed, the return of Christ is not portrayed as panic or spectacle. It is portrayed as fulfillment. The Ethiopian biblical imagination, shaped by texts like the Gospels, Enoch, and Revelation, consistently emphasizes that judgment and renewal are inseparable. Christ returns not because creation failed beyond repair, but because it is ready to be healed. This is deeply aligned with the language of the New Testament. In the book of Acts, Peter speaks of the restoration of all things. In Revelation, John does not see souls escaping to a distant realm. He sees a renewed heaven and a renewed earth, God dwelling with humanity. Scholars debate how literally to read apocalyptic imagery in Revelation. Some traditions emphasize a millennial kingdom understood in concrete historical terms. Others interpret the language symbolically, as theological drama expressing divine victory. The Ethiopian tradition, while historically shaped by its own liturgical and monastic heritage, leans toward a holistic vision. History moves toward renewal, not annihilation. And this is where the quiet crescendo builds. In Ethiopian preaching, the question was never, when will Christ return? It was, will we be aligned with the kingdom when he does? Date setting was considered spiritually dangerous. History offers sobering examples of movements that predicted specific years, only to face disappointment. The Ethiopian tradition deliberately avoided that path. The focus was readiness prayer, fasting, justice, humility. Hope was never separated from responsibility. NT8. Wright once wrote, God's future is not about abandoning the world, but about renewing it, whether one agrees with every element of his framework or not. That sentence captures something essential. The Ethiopian vision resonates with this restorative hope. Creation which groaned is healed. Truth which was obscured is clarified. Justice, long delayed, is enacted. And justice here is not vengeance, it is vindication. The oppressed are defended. Hidden corruption cannot survive the presence of divine light. Mercy and judgment converge, not as contradiction, but as completion. This is not a sentimental ending. It is a sobering one, because restoration implies exposure. Light reveals as it heals. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's insight echoes again. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. In the Ethiopian imagination, the return of Christ does not simply divide nations or institutions. It reveals hearts. And yet, the tone remains hopeful. The signs were never given to terrify the faithful. They were given to awaken conscience. Ethiopian monastic writings consistently emphasize that eschatology is not about curiosity. It is about alignment, to live as though the kingdom is already near. In that sense, the return of Christ is less interruption and more confirmation. Confirmation of what history has been moving toward all along. Confirmation that moral order is real. Confirmation that injustice is temporary. Confirmation that creation's groaning was not meaningless. So the end in this tradition is not chaos overtaking meaning. It is meaning fulfilled. But perhaps the most unsettling implication is this. If the return is restoration, then the signs we have explored are not distant abstractions, they are mirrors. They ask us not, can you decode the future, but are you living in harmony with the coming renewal? Because if Christ returns not to abandon the world but to restore it, the question shifts from speculation to participation. And that leaves us with one final reflection. If the end of history is not an escape, but a homecoming, not destruction, but renewal, not chaos, but fulfillment, then what does it mean to live today as though restoration is already on the horizon?